She hid her face behind a sack, concealing a truth that would change everything. The mountain man, with calloused hands that had weathered countless storms, approached with trepidation that day. When he finally lifted that makeshift mask, tears streamed down his weathered face uncontrollably. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The golden fields surrounding Frosthaven blazed in autumn splendor as villagers gathered for the annual harvest fair. Wooden stalls lined the village square, overflowing with the season's bounty. Apples piled high in woven baskets, jars of honey gleaming amber in the afternoon light, and handcrafted goods displayed with pride. Children darted between adults, their laughter rising above the murmur of conversation and the occasional bleat of livestock being judged for prizes. Mira moved cautiously through the crowd, her face completely hidden beneath a rough burlap sack with crudely cut eye holes. She kept her head down, fingers nervously tracing the coarse fabric as she navigated the throng. The young woman had become adept at moving this way, though it never grew easier to bear the weight of the stares that followed her. Sidelong glances and poorly concealed snickers trailed in her wake like shadows. "Look, it's the sack girl," whispered one villager to another, not bothering to lower his voice enough. A group of children pointed before their parents hurriedly shushed them, their eyes reflecting a mixture of pity and discomfort. Thomas, her father, had gone to trade with the grain merchant, leaving Mira to wander alone. She had only wanted to glimpse the festivities, perhaps hear old Annel tell one of her stories from a safe distance. Instead, the crush of bodies became overwhelming, the whispers more pointed. Near the edge of the square, where cobblestones gave way to packed earth, Mira's foot caught on an uneven stone. She stumbled forward, arms flailing as she lost her balance. The ground rushed up to meet her, but the impact never came. Strong, weathered hands caught her shoulders, steadying her with surprising gentleness. Mira looked up through the rough eye holes to see Ewan Thorne, the mountain man whose silent presence usually caused villagers to step aside respectfully. His calloused fingers, stained from years of hunting and tanning hides, lingered on her shoulders. Then, without warning, Ewan's hands moved to the rough cord binding the sack around her neck. Before Mira could protest, he untied it with deliberate care. The burlap fell away, revealing her face to the afternoon sun, and the prominent scar that twisted from her left temple down across her cheek. A stunned hush fell over the nearby crowd. Mira froze, exposed and vulnerable. Ewan Thorne stared at her revealed face, his weathered features contorting with an emotion no one in Frosthaven had ever witnessed from the stoic hunter. His eyes welled up, and tears, unseen for decades, streamed down his leathery cheeks. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he gazed at Mira's scarred face. The mountain man was crying. The square erupted into a frenzy of whispers and nervous laughter. Villagers, who moments before had been enjoying the autumn harvest fair, now huddled in tight circles, their eyes darting between Ewan Thorne and the exposed face of the girl. The mountain man's tears, so unexpected from someone known for his stoic silence, streamed down his weathered cheeks, creating rivulets through the dust of his rarely visited village excursion. "What's gotten into him?" someone murmured. "Never seen the old hunter cry before." Tomas pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He reached his daughter with desperate strides, positioning himself between Mira and the prying eyes of Frosthaven's residents. His broad shoulders hunched as if bearing a physical weight, the shame he'd carried for years now magnified under the collective gaze of his neighbors. "Cover yourself," he hissed, fumbling to retrieve the burlap sack that had fallen to the ground. His hands trembled as he tried to shield what he considered their family's disgrace, the prominent scar that marked his daughter's otherwise youthful face. Mira's eyes, wide with the shock of sudden exposure, darted from her father to the weeping mountain man. The connection she'd felt when Ewan's calloused fingers had untied her covering lingered like electricity in the air between them. but the murmurs growing around them became unbearable. "The curse returns," whispered an older woman, making a protective sign with her fingers. "Tomas should know better than to bring her here," added another voice. Unable to withstand the scrutiny, Mira twisted away from her father's grasp. With surprising agility, she darted between the fairgoers, ignoring Tomas's calls to return. Her feet carried her past the last market stalls, beyond the edge of the village square, and toward the sanctuary of the forest that bordered Frosthaven. Ewan watched her flight, his tears slowing as determination replaced his initial shock. In Mira's scarred face and frightened eyes, he had seen the ghost of another girl, his daughter, lost decades ago to the cruelty of whispers and judgment. The memory of his failure to protect his own child surged through him like a physical pain. "Let her go," advised Rurik, the blacksmith's powerful frame blocking Ewan's path. "Some things are meant to stay hidden." The mountain man said nothing, merely brushing past the larger man with surprising strength. His weathered boots left deep imprints in the soft earth as he followed Mira's trail toward the forest edge. Behind him, the village's celebration continued, the momentary disruption already becoming fodder for gossip. But ahead, in the shadows of ancient trees, lay a chance to break generations of silence. Ewan Thorne's boots crushed the autumn leaves as he followed Mira's trail into the forest. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by memories that had haunted him for nearly 20 years. His daughter, Lena, had worn her birthmark like a crown until the village children turned it into a curse. Their mockery had driven her to flee one winter night, never to return. The mountain man's weathered face tightened as he pushed aside a low-hanging branch, determined not to let history repeat itself. The forest whispered around him, golden leaves spiraling down from the canopy. He tracked Mira easily. Her panicked flight had left clear signs that his experienced eyes could follow. When he found her huddled behind a fallen oak, her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Her fingers clutched at the moss-covered bark as if it might shield her from the world's cruelty. "Girl," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The single word hung between them. Mira flinched but didn't run. Her breath came in quick, ragged gasps, her scarred face half hidden behind her hair. The resemblance to his Lena was like a knife twisting in his chest, not in appearance, but in that same wounded dignity. Instead of approaching further, Ewan lowered himself to sit on a nearby stump. He didn't speak again. Words had never been his strength, and platitudes would only cheapen what she was feeling. The hunter simply existed in her space, offering silent companionship as the forest settled around them. Minutes passed. The girl's breathing gradually slowed. She stole a glance at him, quickly looking away when their eyes met. But in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared pain that transcended the need for explanation. Ewan pulled a small wooden flask from his coat and offered it to her. "Pine needle tea," he explained when she hesitated. "Helps with the cold." Mira accepted it cautiously, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. As she sipped the bitter liquid, the mountain man studied the canopy above them, giving her privacy while maintaining his presence. "They'll never stop," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. He nodded slowly. "No," he agreed, honesty being the only gift he could offer. "But you might stop caring so much." Something shifted in her expression. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the seed of resilience. Ewan felt an unexpected lightness in his chest. His tears in the square had been for Lena, but his resolve now was for this girl, Thomas's daughter, who carried her own visible wounds with such familiar grace. When he finally stood and offered his hand, Mira took it. Thomas yanked Mira through the village path, his fingers digging into her wrist as they hurried away from the square. His face was flushed with humiliation, jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. The few villagers they passed quickly averted their eyes, but their whispers followed like persistent shadows. "What were you thinking?" he hissed once they were beyond earshot. Letting that mountain man remove your covering in front of everyone? Mira stumbled to keep pace with her father. I didn't let him. He just... Silence! Tomas pushed open the door to their cottage, practically shoving her inside. Years of careful living, ruined in an instant. Did you see how they looked at us? The small dwelling felt even more confining than usual. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a bitter-sweet fragrance that couldn't mask the tension. Mira stood in the center of the room, her scarred face now fully visible in the dim light filtering through the small windows. The sack protects you, Tomas said, his voice softening slightly as he retrieved the burlap covering from where it dangled around her neck. It's not punishment, it's mercy. Tears welled in Mira's eyes. Mercy for whom, Father? For me or for you? Her question hung in the air, unanswered. Tomas turned away, busying himself with the hearth fire, unable to face the truth in her words. His shoulders slumped with the weight of years spent managing others' perceptions. You don't understand what they're capable of, he finally muttered. The whispers, the cruelty. I understand better than anyone, she replied quietly. As evening descended, a gentle knock interrupted their strained silence. Helga stood at the threshold, her basket of remedies hanging from one arm. The healer's eyes, kind but tired, immediately found Mira's face. I thought you might need something for the shock, she explained, though they all knew her visit had deeper purpose. Tomas gestured her inside with reluctant courtesy. We're managing fine. Helga moved with practiced efficiency, brewing a calming tea while stealing glances at Mira's exposed scar. The healer's fingers twitched slightly, as if remembering the fever that had marked the girl years ago. The fever she couldn't fully cure. Ewan Thorne has always kept to himself, Helga remarked carefully. For him to react so publicly, it means something. It means nothing, Tomas snapped, though uncertainty flickered across his features. Mira accepted the steaming cup from Helga, their fingers briefly touching. In that moment of connection, the healer's eyes conveyed what her position wouldn't allow her to say aloud, that perhaps the time for hiding was coming to an end. As Helga prepared to leave, she paused at the door. The village has many opinions, Tomas, but not all scars need covering to heal. The news of Ewan Thorne's tears spread through Frosthaven faster than autumn frost. By sunrise, every cottage buzzed with whispered accounts of what had transpired at the harvest fair. Children mimicked the mountain man's breakdown, while women speculated over morning bread about what had caused such a display from someone known for his stoic silence. Rurik stood at his forge, Dingas, the rhythmic clanging of his hammer punctuating his words as villagers gathered to hear his take. A man who weeps in public has lost his strength, the blacksmith declared, his muscular arms glistening with sweat as he shaped hot metal. And for what? A girl marked by misfortune? He lowered his voice conspiratorially. My grandmother taught me that visible marks are warnings from the spirits, signs of inner corruption that eventually surfaces on the skin. Paul, his words found fertile ground among those already uneasy about Mira's scar. By midday, mothers were pulling their children closer when Tomas passed by the well, as if his daughter's condition might somehow be catching. Did you see how he looked at her? Whispered a farmer's wife at the marketplace. As if he recognized something in her face. Perhaps they share the same curse. Meanwhile, in her small cottage at the village edge, old Annel received a steady stream of visitors seeking her wisdom. The elderly storyteller sat by her hearth, her gnarled fingers working wool as she spoke with measured certainty. The mountain spirits do indeed mark those they touch, she acknowledged, but not as punishment. Her eyes twinkled in the firelight. They mark those destined for greatness, those who will bring change when change is needed most. She told ancient tales of scarred heroes and heroines who had saved villages from drought, famine, and conflict. The marks are gifts of sight, Annel insisted. Those who bear them see truths others cannot. By evening, the village was divided. Some crossed the street to avoid Tomas's cottage, while others left small bundles of herbs or freshly baked bread at his doorstep, silent offerings of solidarity. Helga moved between both camps, her position as healer requiring neutrality. Yet those who watched closely noted how she defended Mira when conversations grew cruel, suggesting the scar was merely a reminder of the girl's survival against fever. In his mountain cabin, Ewan remained unaware of how his moment of vulnerability had polarized the village. He sat alone, carving a small wooden figure, something he hadn't done since his daughter disappeared years ago. His weathered hands moved with purpose, shaping what looked suspiciously like a girl with a marked face. Winter descended upon Frosthaven with unexpected ferocity. The first snowfall came 3 weeks earlier than anyone had anticipated, blanketing the village in a pristine white shroud that quickly turned treacherous. Villagers hurried to secure their livestock and gather final provisions, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "The mountain spirits are restless this year," old Annel muttered as she watched the darkening sky from her cottage window. Few dismissed her words. The storyteller's predictions often held truth. The ancient law of winter hospitality had governed Frosthaven for generations, a tradition born of necessity in a place where survival depended on mutual aid. No matter what grievances existed between neighbors, when winter storms threatened life, doors must open to those in need. Even the most bitter enemies were bound by this sacred obligation. Mira had been helping Helga collect pine needles for medicinal tea when the blizzard struck without warning. The healer's basket was half filled when the sky transformed from gray to near black, unleashing a fury of wind and snow that reduced visibility to mere feet. "We must find shelter immediately," Helga shouted over the howling wind, her experienced eyes recognizing the deadly potential of the storm. Tomas, who had been chopping wood nearby, rushed to join them, his face etched with concern for his daughter. "The village is too far," he yelled, snow already accumulating on his shoulders. "Ewan's cabin is closest." Mira's heart raced at the mention of the mountain man. Since the incident at the harvest fair, she had avoided him, unsure how to face the man whose tears had exposed her to the village's scrutiny. Yet now, survival trumped discomfort. The three struggled through thickening snow, following a barely visible path that wound upward through the pines. By the time they spotted smoke curling from Ewan Thorne's chimney, their limbs were numb with cold and exhaustion threatened to overcome them. Ewan opened his door before they could knock, as if he had sensed their approach. His weathered face registered surprise, then understanding as he wordlessly ushered them inside. The cabin was modest but warm, with furs lining the walls and a hearty fire crackling in the stone hearth. "The law of winter," Thomas acknowledged stiffly, unable to meet Ewan's eyes. The mountain man nodded, hanging their snow-crusted cloaks near the fire. "No one turns away travelers in a storm," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. As Mira huddled near the flames, she realized they were now bound together. 4 souls, sheltering from nature's wrath, forced by ancient custom to share space, food, and fire, until the blizzard released its grip on the mountain. Outside, snow continued to fall, sealing them in for what promised to be long, revealing nights. The pine-scented smoke curled through Ewan Thorne's cabin, stinging eyes already raw from the day's journey. Outside, the blizzard's fury rattled the wooden shutters, transforming Frosthaven's mountains into a howling white prison. Thomas sat stiffly by the hearth, his weathered hands clenched on his knees, every muscle in his body rebelling against their predicament. Being forced to accept shelter from the mountain man, the very person who had exposed his daughter's shame, was a bitter draught to swallow. "The storm won't break until morning," Ewan muttered, hanging a kettle over the flames. His voice, rarely used in the village, seemed to belong to the cabin itself, rough-hewn and solid. Helga busied herself arranging her herbs and remedies on a small table, her usual confident movements now hesitant. The healer's silence spoke volumes, Her inability to prevent Mira's scarring years ago weighed on her still, a professional failure she carried like a stone. Mira huddled near the fire, her slender frame shivering despite the growing warmth. She watched Ewan with curious eyes, no longer hidden behind burlap. When her father dozed off, exhaustion finally overcoming his pride, the mountain man beckoned her to a workbench in the corner. "You want to learn?" he asked simply, gesturing to a half-tanned hide stretched across a wooden frame. She nodded, moving closer. Her fingers, tentative at first, followed his motions as he demonstrated how to scrape and soften the animal skin. "Press here, not too hard," he instructed, his calloused hands guiding hers with unexpected gentleness. As the night deepened, Helga watched from her corner as Ewan showed the girl how to read the stories written in animal tracks. Knowledge typically guarded by hunters and trappers, never shared with village girls, especially not those marked as different. "Fox walks like this," he explained, sketching patterns in a small box of sand kept for the purpose. "See how the paws align? Different from wolf, different from rabbit." Tomas stirred in his sleep, muttering something unintelligible, his face contorted with worry even in dreams. The cabin, built for one solitary man, now held 4 souls and all their unspoken burdens. By midnight, the wind's howl had become a lullaby of sorts. Mira's quick mind absorbed everything Ewan shared, her questions growing bolder as trust tentatively formed between them. Helga eventually joined them, offering her own knowledge of which plants grew near certain animal paths. The mountain man's home, once a fortress of isolation, was transforming with each passing hour. Between the walls that had known only one man's grief, something unexpected was taking root. Connection. As embers glowed in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, the cabin became not just shelter from the storm, but a crucible where shame and silence began to yield to something stronger. The blizzard's fury rattled the wooden shutters of Ewan Thorne's mountain cabin. Inside, the 4 reluctant companions huddled around the stone hearth, their faces painted orange by the dancing flames. The howling wind outside made conversation both necessary and somehow safer, as if the storm might carry away their words before they became too heavy. Mira sat cross-legged on a worn bearskin, her fingers tracing the edge of a half-tanned hide. Ewan had been teaching her to work the leather, and she'd taken to it naturally. The mountain man watched her from his chair, his weathered face a map of unspoken sorrows. "I had a daughter once," Ewan said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the wind. Everyone froze. The mountain man never spoke of his past. "Her name was Lena. She had a birthmark across her cheek, not unlike your scar." Tomas shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Mira's hands stilled on the leather. "The village children were cruel," Ewan continued, his calloused fingers gripping his knees. "I told her to be strong, to ignore them. I was wrong." His voice cracked. "She disappeared one spring morning. I found her shawl by the river's edge. I should have protected her better." Mira looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "What happened wasn't your fault," she said softly. "Nor is what happened to you your fault," he replied, meeting her gaze. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling fire and howling wind. Helga, who had been grinding herbs in the corner, set down her mortar with a decisive thud. "I need to confess something," the healer announced, her usually confident voice wavering. "When Mira was 7, she developed a terrible fever. Tomas brought her to me in secret, afraid of what the village might say." Tomas's head snapped up. "Helga, please." "No, it needs to be said," she insisted. "I treated her, but the fever left its mark. I've carried that guilt for years, knowing I couldn't prevent the scar that's caused so much pain." Mira stared at the healer, pieces of her childhood suddenly shifting into place. "You used to leave bundles of herbs by our door," she whispered. Helga nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I couldn't do more openly. The village has always feared what they don't understand. Ewan rose and added another log to the fire. Fear makes cowards of us all, he said. I've hidden in these mountains rather than face mine. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, the four continued to share their burdens, stories untold for years, now flowing freely in the safety of the cabin. By morning, when the blizzard finally subsided, something had changed between them. The uneasy trust forged in that long night would be tested in the days ahead, but for now, it was enough to have spoken their truths aloud. While the blizzard howled around Ewan's cabin, life in Frosthaven continued its uneasy rhythm. Rurik stood at his forge, the orange glow illuminating his scowling face as he hammered metal with unnecessary force. The blacksmith had been watching the shifting dynamics of the village with calculating eyes. A mountain man sheltering the marked girl, he muttered to the three men gathered in his workshop. What next? Shall we invite the wolves to guard our sheep? The men nodded, warming their hands by the forge. Rurik had carefully selected his audience, all fathers with marriageable daughters, all anxious about their standing in the community. Ewan Thorne has always been strange, he continued, setting down his hammer. But taking in that girl shows weakness of mind. The old ways exist for a reason. Later that evening, Rurik made his way through the snowy paths to Thomas's cottage. He knew the man would return once the storm cleared. The blacksmith carried a small pouch of coins. Not much, but enough to seem generous to a desperate father. When Tomas finally trudged home 3 days later, Rurik was waiting. The exhausted father barely had time to stoke his cold hearth before a knock announced his visitor. "I've come with a proposition," Rurik said, settling himself uninvited at the table. "One that could solve many problems." Tomas regarded him warily, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Your daughter needs protection, proper protection," the blacksmith continued, "not the charity of a mountain hermit. I'm offering to take her as my wife." Tomas's eyes widened. "Mira? But you've never shown interest." "I'm showing interest now," Rurik interrupted, placing the coin pouch on the table. "Consider it a bride price. Generous, given her condition." The father stared at the coins, his mind racing. Marriage to the blacksmith would mean security, food through winter, and perhaps even respect by association. The village would see it as an act of charity, Rurik taking damaged goods. But Thomas had seen how Mira changed at Ewan's cabin, standing straighter, speaking more freely. "She's young yet," Thomas said cautiously. Rurik leaned forward. "Young women need guidance, and I could use her connection to Thorne. That old man knows where the best hunting grounds are, where to find rare metals in the mountains. Information worth having." Thomas felt something twist inside him. The realization that this wasn't about Mira at all. She was merely a tool to control Ewan. "I'll consider it," he said finally. As Rurik left, satisfaction evident in his stride, Tomas remained at the table, the pouch of coins untouched. The weight of tradition pressed down on him, demanding he accept. Yet for the first time, he questioned whether those traditions truly protected his daughter, or simply made her easier to control. The ice-crusted snow finally yielded to the weak winter sun. Ewan Thorne led the small party down the winding mountain path, his experienced feet finding safe passage where others might stumble. Mira followed closely, her face uncovered in the presence of those who had shared the storm's confinement. Behind them, Tomas and Helga trudged carefully, exchanging glances that spoke of their changed perspective. When they reached the village, they found Frosthaven's residents haggard and hollow-cheeked. The prolonged blizzard had depleted many food stores faster than anticipated. Children with pinched faces peered from doorways as the mountain man and his companions passed. "The winter spirits test us," Old Anil remarked, meeting them at the village square. The storyteller's eyes lingered on Mira's scar with newfound interest. That evening, Ewan returned with sleds, laden with preserved meats and bundles of pine needles. "The tea will keep sickness at bay," he explained, his voice rough from disuse. Villagers who had once crossed the street to avoid Mira now accepted cups of steaming pine needle brew from her hands, their hunger and desperation temporarily outweighing their superstition. In the blacksmith's workshop, Rurik hammered metal with unusual force. "Convenient, isn't it?" he muttered to the men gathered for warmth. The mountain man suddenly playing savior. The blacksmith's words fell on receptive ears. "My grandfather always said mountain folk who hoard food bring the harshest winters. Perhaps Thorn's kindness is what cursed us with this storm." The whispers spread through Frosthaven like frost across a windowpane. Some villagers began refusing Ewen's provisions, preferring hunger to what they now feared was tainted generosity. Helga confronted these rumors directly. "Nonsense," the healer declared, distributing dried herbs to supplement the dwindling food. "Ewen saved us. Without his shelter, we would have perished in the storm." While adults debated in hushed tones, old Annel gathered the village children around her hearth. "Did you know," she whispered dramatically, "that the mountain spirits sometimes mark those chosen to bring change?" Her gnarled finger traced an invisible line across her cheek. A scar like Mira's was once believed to mark those who could see beyond the veil of our world. The children's eyes widened as they absorbed this new perspective on the girl they had been taught to mock. Tomas, overhearing the storyteller's words, felt something shift within his chest. He watched his daughter distribute Ewen's provisions, her movements confident, despite the sidelong glances she still received. That night, as Mira prepared their meager supper, she caught her father studying her face without shame for the first time in years. Outside their cottage, the wind carried both Rurik's poisonous whispers and old Annel's seeds of prophecy through Frosthaven's snow-laden streets, setting the stage for conflicts yet to come. The first breath of spring swept through Frosthaven, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing green shoots from the thawing earth. With the changing season came the village's oldest tradition, the river cleansing rite, where villagers would wade into the icy waters to wash away winter's burdens and welcome new beginnings. In the Elder Council's hut, heated debate erupted over Mira's participation. Elder Greta's voice rose above the others, her weathered finger pointing accusingly. "The girl is marked. Her presence could taint the waters for all of us." "Nonsense," old Annel countered, her storyteller's voice carrying weight despite her frail frame. "The river accepts all who come with honest hearts. The child has suffered enough." The argument continued late into the night until Helga, who rarely spoke at such gatherings, stood firmly. "I have tended to every birth, death, and illness in this village for 20 years. If anyone understands purity, it is me." The girl participates. When dawn broke on the day of the ritual, villagers gathered at the riverbank, dressed in simple white garments. Mira stood apart, her father Tomas beside her, his eyes darting nervously between his daughter and the whispering crowd. Ewen Thorn appeared at the forest's edge, surprising many who had never seen the mountain man attend the ceremony before. He nodded silently toward the girl, his presence a silent declaration of support. One by one, villagers stepped into the frigid waters, gasping as the cold embraced their ankles, then knees. When Mira's turn came, she hesitated only briefly before removing her outer garment. Beneath it, she wore the traditional white shift like everyone else, but her scarred face remained uncovered for all to see. The crowd held its breath as she waded in. The icy water swirled around her calves, then her thighs as she moved deeper than most dared go. Just as she submerged to her shoulders, a shadow passed overhead. A hawk, russet-winged and magnificent, circled 3 times above Mira before letting out a piercing cry that echoed across the valley. Elder Greta crossed herself. "A sign," she whispered, her earlier condemnation forgotten in the face of what many recognized as an omen. Helga smiled knowingly as the healer caught Ewen's eye across the crowd. The mountain man's weathered face betrayed nothing, but his stance had relaxed. As Mira emerged from the river, water streaming from her hair and clothes, something had shifted in the village's perception. Children who once mocked her now watched with wide-eyed wonder. Adults who had turned away in discomfort now stole curious glances. Perhaps, one villager murmured to another, "We've misunderstood the meaning of her mark all along." The late snowstorm came without warning, blanketing Frosthaven just as the first lambs and calves of spring had arrived. Villagers rushed to shelter their animals, but several newborns had been separated from their mothers in the sudden white fury. Mira stood at her cottage window, watching farmers struggle through knee-deep drifts. "They'll freeze by morning," she whispered, her fingers tracing the familiar ridges of her scar. Without hesitation, she bundled herself in layers of wool and fur, ignoring her father's protests. Thomas grabbed her arm, fear etching his weathered face. "The village will say you've cursed the weather," he warned. "Let them," she replied, pulling away. "I know how to find what's lost." Outside, the wind cut like a knife, but Mira moved with purpose. She remembered Ewan's lessons, how to read the subtle depressions in snow, how animals seek shelter against the wind. Following these signs, she located a trembling lamb curled beneath a fallen log. The tiny creature's breath came in shallow puffs. Mira tucked the lamb inside her coat and continued. By midday, she had rescued 3 lambs and a calf, using the techniques the mountain man had taught her during those long blizzard nights in his cabin. She fashioned a makeshift sled from branches and rope, just as Ewan had shown her, to transport the weakened animals back to the village. When she arrived, pulling her precious cargo, several villagers stopped to stare. The sight of Mira, face uncovered, scar gleaming in the winter light, returning with their livestock alive, was something none had expected. "The animals would have died without her," Helga announced, helping Mira deliver the lambs to their grateful owners. The healer's eyes shone with pride as she watched the girl she had secretly protected for so long. That evening, as the elders gathered to discuss the storm damage, Helga entered their circle uninvited. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "Today I saw strength where you see only shame," she declared, facing the group of weathered men and women. Mira saved what we could not. Her scars didn't weaken her. They made her stronger. The elders shifted uncomfortably. One began to protest, but Helga continued. "We mark our tools when they're special. We cherish the distinctive grain in our wooden bowls. Why then do we shun a child marked by life?" She paused, her voice softening. "Perhaps the gods mark those who carry special purpose." Her words hung in the air like frost crystals. Some elders frowned, but others nodded slowly. For the first time, doubt crept into their certainty. Outside, the rescued animals nursed from their mothers, their bleating a testament to life preserved against all odds, just like the scarred girl who had saved them. The village square buzzed with tension as Rurik stepped forward, his broad blacksmith shoulders squared with purpose. The afternoon sun glinted off his tools, carefully arranged at his feet like weapons for the coming battle. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the blacksmith's thunderous voice calling for justice. "We've tolerated enough," Rurik declared, pointing an accusing finger at Mira, who stood beside Ewan Thorne. "Our ancestors knew what marks like hers meant. The drought, the early frost, these are warnings we ignore at our peril." Mira's fingers instinctively reached toward her face, then stopped midair. She would not hide today. The young woman had spent the morning helping Helga prepare remedies, earning small nods of appreciation from those who'd come seeking the healer's aid. "The old laws are clear," the blacksmith continued, his voice carrying across the square. "Those marked by the mountain spirits must be sent back to them, for the safety of all Frosthaven." He pulled a weathered scroll from his belt, waving it like a battle standard. "Exile is the only answer." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, their faces pinched with superstition and fear. Others looked uncertain, glancing between Mira and the mountain man who stood protectively at her side. "Speak, Ewan," Rurik challenged. "You who lived so long apart from us. Will you put one girl above the village's survival?" Ewan stepped forward, his weathered face calm but resolute. For decades, the villagers had known him only as the silent hunter who traded furs for supplies, then vanished back into the mountains. His voice, when it finally came, carried the weight of stone. "You misread the old ways, Rurik," he said, each word deliberate. "Our ancestors feared what they didn't understand, but they also honored strength." He placed a gentle hand on Mira's shoulder. "This girl saved your livestock when the late snow came. She tends your sick alongside Helga. Her scars aren't curses, they're proof she survived." Old Annel nodded from her place near the well, her ancient eyes bright with approval. "The true curse on Frosthaven," Ewan continued, his voice growing stronger, "is not marks on skin, but the marks we leave on hearts when we teach children to fear difference." Tomas pushed through the crowd to stand beside his daughter, his earlier shame transformed into quiet dignity. "My silence has done this," Mira's father admitted. "I let fear rule where love should have guided." Rurik spat on the ground, his plans unraveling. "Pretty words won't bring rain or fill empty bellies," he growled. But the blacksmith's challenge had backfired. The mountain man's truth, spoken plainly and without artifice, had struck something deep in the villagers' hearts. One by one, they began to disperse, leaving Rurik alone with his scroll and his anger, while Ewan, Mira, and Thomas walked away together. Three figures bound not by fear, but by something far stronger. Thomas stood in the doorway of their small cottage, watching Mira tend to the herbs Helga had given her. The morning light caught the ridged texture of his daughter's scar, and for the first time in years, he truly saw her, not the mark, but the young woman who had endured so much. His shoulders sagged with the weight of recognition. "I've been a coward," he whispered, his voice cracking. "All these seasons, hiding you away as if you were something to be ashamed of." Mira turned, her fingers still coated with soil. The surprise in her eyes spoke volumes. "Father?" Tomas crossed the room and knelt beside her, his weathered hands trembling as he reached for hers. "When Rurik came yesterday, offering those coins for your hand, speaking of you like damaged goods to be bartered," his voice faltered. "I saw myself through his eyes, and I couldn't bear it." Outside, the village was stirring to life. The blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance, punctuating their silence. "What did you tell him?" Mira asked, barely breathing. "I told him my daughter isn't for sale," Tomas replied, a newfound strength in his voice. "Not to him, not to anyone who sees only scars instead of strength." Tears welled in Mira's eyes as her father continued. "I've watched Ewan stand tall while the village whispered. I've seen Helga defend you when I remained silent. Even old Annel spins her tales to change hearts, while I—" he swallowed hard. "I gave you a sack instead of my courage." He reached for the burlap sack hanging by the door, the fabric worn thin from years of use. With deliberate movements, he walked to the hearth and cast it into the flames. "No more," he declared. That afternoon, father and daughter walked together through the village square. Mira's face was bare, her scar visible to all. Tomas walked beside her, his head held high, despite the whispers that followed them. Several villagers stopped to stare. A child pointed before being hushed by its mother. Yet others, who had witnessed Mira's kindness during the winter or her skill with the animals, offered tentative nods of acknowledgement. Near the well, they encountered Rurik, whose face darkened at the sight of them. The blacksmith made to step forward, but Ewan Thorne appeared suddenly beside them, his silent presence a bulwark against malice. "My daughter has nothing to hide," Thomas announced, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And neither do I." That evening, 3 villagers brought fresh bread to their door, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. As Mira accepted their offerings, her face uncovered and her smile genuine, something shifted in Frosthaven. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile seed of understanding. Old Annel's gnarled fingers clutched her walking stick as she shuffled into the village square where a small crowd had gathered. The evening air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as villagers huddled together, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames of the communal fire. Mira stood beside her father, her uncovered face drawing curious glances rather than the usual mockery. "Listen well," Annel called out, her voice stronger than her frail frame suggested. "Our mountains hold secrets older than Frosthaven itself." The storyteller's eyes found Mira's starred face, and she nodded knowingly. The village elder settled onto a wooden stool, and the crowd drew closer. Children sat cross-legged at her feet, while adults leaned forward, their daily worries momentarily forgotten. Tomas placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder, his earlier shame now replaced with cautious pride. "In the time of our ancestors," Annel began, "the mountains blessed certain children with marks upon their skin. Her weathered hands traced an invisible pattern in the air. These marked ones could see what others could not, hidden springs that bring life when drought threatens to take it." Helga, standing near the back, exchanged a meaningful glance with Ewan Thorne. The mountain man remained silent, but his eyes never left Mira. "The last marked child lived 5 generations ago," continued the storyteller. "She led our people to water when the crops withered and the livestock grew thin. Her scars, like flowing water across her face, were not a curse, but a map, a blessing from the mountains themselves." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some villagers nodded in recognition of the old tale, while others shifted uncomfortably. Rurik scoffed from his position by the blacksmith's workshop, but fewer heads turned his way than before. "Perhaps," Annel said, her voice dropping to ensure everyone leaned closer, "the mountains have sent us another guide in our time of need." All eyes turned to Mira. The girl stood straighter, her hand unconsciously touching the scar that had defined her life. For the first time, she did not flinch under their gaze. "Nonsense," someone muttered, but the objection lacked conviction. As the fire crackled and sparks drifted skyward, the story took root in the collective imagination of Frosthaven. Children began to eye Mira with wonder instead of fear. Older villagers recalled droughts of years past and glanced nervously at the cloudless sky. The line between curse and blessing blurred that night. Hope and fear intermingled as the village considered what it might mean if the old legends were true. Mira felt the weight of their expectations settle upon her shoulders, both burden and gift. When the gathering dispersed, Tomas walked beside his daughter with his head held higher than it had been in years. The prophecy had changed something fundamental in Frosthaven, though none could yet say where this new path might lead. The merciless summer sun beat down on Frosthaven, cracking the earth and withering crops in the fields. 3 weeks without rain had transformed the once fertile soil into a dusty wasteland. Villagers watched the cloudless sky with growing desperation, their water barrels dwindling to muddy dregs. "We haven't seen a drought like this in 20 summers, one of the elders lamented, as they gathered in the village square. The council had tried everything, ancient prayers, offerings of grain, even sacrificing precious coins at the river's edge. Yet the heavens remained sealed, indifferent to their pleas. Mira stood at the edge of the gathering, her scarred face now visible to all. She watched as Tomas joined the other men in digging deeper wells that yielded only dust. Her father's shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but he no longer hid her away. That, at least, was something to be grateful for. That evening, as lantern light flickered against cottage walls, Mira remembered old Annel's prophecy about mountain springs revealed by those marked with scars. The storyteller had woven tales of hidden waters that could save villages in times of greatest need. "What if it's not just a story?" she whispered to Helga, who was sorting through nearly depleted herb stores. The healer looked up, her eyes brightening with hope. "The old stories often hold truth," the woman replied, setting down her basket, "and we have nothing left to lose." By morning, Mira had convinced a small group to follow her into the mountains. Ewan Thorne, naturally, along with Helga, Tomas, and 3 young men from the village. Even Rurik watched them leave, his skepticism plain, but his desperation greater. "The mountain doesn't give up its secrets easily," Ewan cautioned as they climbed higher, the village shrinking behind them. His knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as he pointed out animal tracks that might lead to water. They followed deer trails and examined moss patterns, using the skills Ewan had taught Mira during their winter confinement. The sun climbed higher, and hope began to waver. "We should turn back," one of the young men suggested, his water skin nearly empty. "Not yet," Mira insisted, touching the scar on her face. Something pulled her forward, a certainty she couldn't explain. The story says the spring reveals itself to those who bear marks of suffering. Tomas watched his daughter with newfound respect. The girl who once hid behind a sack now led them confidently through treacherous terrain. Whatever they found, he realized, she had already discovered something more valuable: her own worth. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Mira paused at a rocky outcrop. "Listen," she said, closing her eyes. The faintest sound of trickling water echoed from somewhere beyond. Her scar, once a symbol of shame, had become their beacon of hope. The sun beat down mercilessly as Mira led the small group deeper into the mountain terrain. Her face, fully exposed to the harsh light, glistened with sweat as she studied the ground. 3 days of searching had yielded nothing but parched earth and dwindling hope. "There," she whispered, crouching to examine a set of deer tracks pressed into the dusty soil. "They're fresh, heading upward." She glanced back at Ewan Thorne, who nodded in silent approval. The mountain man had taught her well over the winter months. Animals, especially in drought, would always find water. The village's survival now depended on this knowledge that would have remained foreign to her had she kept her face hidden behind burlap. Tomas watched his daughter with newfound respect. The father who once insisted she hide her scar now followed her lead, his weathered face showing both pride and lingering shame. "The tracks converge here," Mira explained, pointing to where several animal paths merged into a narrow trail winding between 2 rocky outcroppings. "Just like you taught me," she added, catching Ewan's eye. He smiled faintly. The student surpasses the teacher. The group pressed on, climbing higher until they reached a small plateau. Helga, breathing heavily from the ascent, steadied herself against a boulder. The healer had insisted on joining despite her age, carrying pouches of herbs in case anyone fell ill during their desperate search. "Listen," Mira said suddenly, raising her hand. A faint trickling sound echoed from beyond a cluster of pines. Following the sound, they pushed through the branches and emerged into a small clearing. There, bubbling up from between moss-covered rocks, flowed a spring of crystal-clear water. "The mountain has blessed us," Helga whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Mira approached the spring slowly, kneeling beside it. As she leaned forward, her reflection appeared in the still pool where the water collected. The scar that traced from her temple to her jaw was clearly visible in the water's mirror. Old Annel's prophecy echoed in everyone's minds. The marked one shall lead them to waters hidden by the mountain spirits. Tomas filled his water skin, tasting the sweet liquid. "It's pure," he confirmed. "Enough to irrigate the fields, if we can channel it." Ewan placed a hand on Mira's shoulder. "You've done what no one else could." Word spread quickly when they returned to Frosthaven. Villagers who once averted their eyes from Mira's face now looked at her with something new: gratitude, respect, even awe. Rurik stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, his expression unreadable as the blacksmith watched his influence wane. That evening, as villagers organized teams to build irrigation channels from the spring, old Anil approached Mira. "The mountains marked you," the storyteller said softly, "not to curse you, but to save us all." The harvest fair had returned to Frosthaven, painting the village square with autumn's golden hues, just as it had 1 year before. This time, however, Mira stood at the edge of the gathering, with her head held high, her scarred face visible to all. The burlap sack dangled from her fingers, a reminder of what had been, not what would be. Villagers paused in their celebrations, conversations faltering as they noticed her. Children who once mocked her now watched with curious eyes. The girl's journey from hidden shame to open defiance was written in her steady gaze and straightened shoulders. Ewan Thorne approached from the mountain path, his weathered face softening when he spotted Mira. The mountain man moved with purpose through the crowd, ignoring the whispers that followed him. When he reached her side, he placed his calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "Ready?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She nodded, squeezing the rough fabric of the sack one last time before letting it fall to the ground. Together they walked into the heart of the fair, where old Anil sat telling stories to wide-eyed children. The storyteller's wrinkled face broke into a smile, making room for them in the circle. Tomas stood nearby, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering unease as he watched his daughter take her place among the others. Helga approached with a cup of cider, pressing it into Mira's hands with a knowing nod. The healer's presence lent silent support as more villagers gathered, drawn by curiosity and the palpable shift in the air. When Rurik emerged from his workshop, hammer still in hand, his eyes narrowed at the scene. The blacksmith's influence had waned since the discovery of the spring, but resentment still simmered beneath his forced smile. "A year ago," Ewan began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square, "I stood here and wept for what I saw." Tears gathered in his eyes once more, but these were different, clear and unashamed. "I wept for memories, for my own failures, and for a village that hides its heart behind masks of tradition." He gestured toward Mira's scar, visible for all to see. Scars are not curses, they are stories written on skin, proof that we have survived. The mountain man's tears fell freely now, tracking down his weathered cheeks. "This girl saved your crops, your animals, your children's futures. She found water when the skies gave none." His voice broke, but he continued. "And all she asked in return was to be seen, truly seen." The silence that followed was profound, not the silence of judgment that had haunted Mira for years, but the silence of a community facing its reflection and finding it wanting. The first frost of autumn painted the village square with crystalline patterns as children gathered around Mira. They no longer pointed or whispered behind cupped hands. Instead, they circled her eagerly, eyes wide with wonder rather than mockery. "Can you show us how to find rabbit tracks?" asked a small girl with braided hair, her fingers tentatively reaching for Mira's hand. Mira nodded, her scarred face catching the morning light. The mark that had once defined her shame now seemed to glow with purpose. She led the children to the forest edge, demonstrating how to spot the subtle impressions in fallen leaves. The youngsters followed her instructions with reverence, a stark contrast to the cruel giggles that had once trailed her through these same paths. Back in the village, Helga stood before the gathered elders, her voice steady as she spoke of Mira's courage. "The girl has shown us what true strength looks like," the healer declared. "Her scar is not a curse, but a map that led us to salvation." Several heads nodded in agreement, the memory of the life-saving spring still fresh in their minds. Thomas walked through the marketplace, his shoulders no longer hunched with shame. Villagers who had once avoided his gaze now offered greetings, some even stopping to discuss the coming winter or share news. The father who had hidden his daughter away now stood tall, accepting a basket of apples from a neighbor with genuine gratitude. "Your daughter has taught us all something," the neighbor said, her words carrying across the square. Even the children of families who had been most vocal in their cruelty now approached Thomas with questions about mountain herbs and animal habits, knowledge his daughter had shared freely despite years of rejection. In his workshop, Rurik hammered metal with unusual force, the rhythmic clanging betraying his frustration. The blacksmith had lost his audience for whispered fears and accusations. When a young boy entered, asking for a knife like the one Mira uses to mark trail signs, Rurik's face darkened. Yet he crafted the blade without comment, aware that fighting the changing tide would only leave him stranded. Old Annel sat by the communal fire each evening, her weathered face crinkling with satisfaction as she watched the transformation unfold. "The mountains always know," she would say to anyone who would listen. "They mark those who will lead us through the darkest times." The customs that had once bound Frosthaven in rigid judgment began to loosen like ice in spring thaw. What remained was something stronger, a community learning that compassion could weather any storm better than fear ever could. The autumn sun bathed Frosthaven in golden light as Mira stood at the edge of the village square, her face uncovered for all to see. The warmth caressed her scarred skin, no longer a source of shame, but a testament to her journey. Children played nearby, occasionally glancing at her with curiosity rather than fear, some even offering shy smiles before returning to their games. Ewan Thorne watched from a distance, his weathered face softened by something that had been absent for decades: peace. The mountain man's shoulders, once perpetually hunched under the weight of old grief, now stood straighter. His tears had dried, replaced by quiet pride as he observed the young woman who had helped him find forgiveness for himself. "I never thought I'd see this day," Helga murmured, approaching Mira with a bundle of dried herbs. The healer's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "The village has changed because of you." Mira shook her head. "Because of all of us," she corrected, taking the bundle with gratitude. She glanced toward her father, who was deep in conversation with old Annel near the communal well. Thomas had undergone perhaps the most profound transformation. No longer did he hunch and hurry through the village, avoiding eyes and conversation. Instead, he stood tall, occasionally touching his daughter's shoulder with open affection when they walked together. Even Rurik had been forced to adapt. The blacksmith still scowled when Mira passed his workshop. But the venom had largely left his words. His influence had waned as the village discovered that compassion yielded far more than fear ever could. "Will you join us for the winter preparation?" Helga asked. "Many of the younger ones want to learn your methods for preserving the pine needles for tea." Mira nodded, her fingers unconsciously tracing the line of her scar. The gesture, once born of shame, had transformed into a habit of thoughtful reflection. Later, as evening approached, Ewan and Mira walked the path between the village and his cabin, a journey they now shared regularly. Neither spoke much. They had never needed many words between them. "The hardest chains to break are the ones we forge ourselves," Ewan finally said, his voice rough from disuse. Shame, guilt, fear. Mira understood. The burlap sack that had hidden her face for so long now served as kindling for Ewan's hearth fire, its purpose transformed, just as they had been. In Frosthaven, winter would soon arrive again, but this time without the bitter chill of isolation. The hidden spring Mira had discovered continued to flow, nourishing not just the land, but the spirit of the community. The village had learned that scars, whether visible on skin or hidden in hearts, were not curses to fear, but stories to honor. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Mira lifted her face to the sky, catching them on her eyelashes, her cheeks, her scars. She was finally completely free.